So the C-suite was actually where I made a lot of my mistakes, especially my first role, because I realized that I can't convince them because I know the space, and I can't convince them because we're going to build really cool stuff. What I learned first and foremost in my first C-suite gig was you have to build the relationships with them and ask for nothing in return. And then once
Yeah.
you build the relationships and you ask for something in return, they're willing to give you a chance because they bought into you. I had no idea that's what this game was about. And I made that mistake. I didn't. I thought just being smart was good enough and building cool things were good enough. And that was not the case. But it wasn't until I got into the C suite that I realized how much the business did not appreciate data and analytics and tech. I'm going to use like an umbrella term. Um, I know we use words like tech as an enabler, uh, but part of that also means that it's an afterthought. Here's what I want to do, go figure it out. But they don't want to be involved in the sausage making, and they have to be involved in the sausage making because sometimes they may ask for something. It's not really what they want. And then you go off building something and you realize, and they're like, that's not what I wanted. And you're like, well, this is what you said. And then you put in all that effort and time and you kill yourself because you want to deliver a great product, only to find out that no, they meant something else.
Are you human?
Hi, Sol. It's been a pleasure to have you here. I've been following all your things you're posting and doing, and on LinkedIn you are very active. I saw that you just launched, or you launched a book, or it's going to be launched end of April, right?
Yeah. So that's the interesting thing. Like, I am active because for so long I've been doing the work, not talking about the work. And I was asked to start writing about pieces and stuff. And then I was approached by a publisher to write the book because I think there's very few folks in the market that have hands-on experience, and it's not theoretical or practical or based on things they read, but based on mistakes they've made because they've read it, they've tried it, or they didn't know because there wasn't any articles or newsletters or blogs. And they're like, okay, we're going to set up a COE for AI, or we're going to develop these capabilities. How do we embed it into the existing operating model? Um, and so it was just role after role, right? The trends would, the buzzwords would change. And so I've been very much focused on doing the work. And then this year is sort of a year of yes, where I'm writing more content, I'm writing newsletters,
Amazing.
and I wrote and published the book. So the Kindle is live now. The hard copy pre-orders are on now, but they officially get sent April 30th. And I'm super excited because we just found out last week that I got bestseller on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Network, and the book review. So it's doing well. And it's crazy because I don't know this process at all. I'm still learning everything about books and content and things. But apparently it's resonating in a few different categories. AI is one of them, but starting a business, leadership and management, because there's a lot of personal stories in there. So it's been a fun ride. This year is all about writing what I've learned the past 20 plus years and some of the things that I discovered while I was in the C-suite position. So very different, very fun.
Definitely, it's resonating so much because there is so much material. Still, it feels like it's a new field, but it's not, because AI has been around for a while, and you've been involved even in Watson project, right, in IBM. So
Yeah.
you know a thing or two. And right now, from what I am seeing around in terms of books or materials, there is a lot of theory, but not so much experience, so that I guess that's
Yeah.
why people
Yeah.
are looking for somewhere.
Everyone's claiming to be an
Yeah,
expert
learnings.
advisor. And I'm like, well, if you take a look at their entire history, they just got into the space a year ago. So I'm like, okay, they're leading the way. But that's why it was important. I think when I titled the book, it was like Scrape Knees, Bruised Elbows,
Yes, exactly.
Learn. It wasn't based off of, I'm the best, here are my successes. I'm like, here are all the mistakes I made. Don't make them. It doesn't work. So I was trying to like turn it around based on like
Uh-huh.
real practical experience. So far, so good. It's resonating well. But yeah, not an easy process. I so much credit to all the writers and authors out there. I didn't realize how difficult it was because it's in your head, but the process of articulating things that you've been doing becomes second nature to you. But putting that down on a piece of paper and in a flow and in a language that anyone can understand, uh, it's definitely a process. So I have great appreciation for all authors and writers.
Yeah, I can only imagine how many revisions or how many changes you would like you had to do for the publisher to feel, okay, this will resonate with, or like people will understand it. Like, did you struggle with it? Like, how did it look like?
My process was every morning from 4:30 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. And I had multiple chapters. I had themes of the chapter, so just titles. I didn't write in sequential order. I would just write as much as I could that day until I was depleted. Then the next day I'd pick the same chapter, finish it until I was depleted. So even though I didn't write the chapters in order, I picked a chapter and I just everything went on paper from like 4:30 to 7:30. And then once it was all done, then I picked chapter by chapter to go through editing and fine tuning. But when I finally got to a point where I said, okay, this is progress over perfection, I gave it to about 5 different people. A dear friend of mine, Joe Reese, who also wrote a book, right? A bestseller, Fundamentals of Data Engineering. His book was really successful. Cindy Houston. I had one of my clients actually read it. They own a digital agency firm. They are not technical, but they hired me to do some work for them. And I was like, Jason, you're like the prime target for this book. Tell me what doesn't make sense. I had another dear friend of mine from Tribe AI. His name was Noah. He went through it. And then my husband, who's not technical whatsoever, he went. So I had 5 editors, all from different walks of life, go through and go, does my language make sense? Does my thought process make sense? Do the graphics make sense? Which stories do you like? Which stories do I need to shorten? And through their critique, then I revised everything and then it was ready to go. But I did the whole thing in like less than 4 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Even more impressed.
Yeah. November was start, February was drop dead turn in. And it was,
Oh.
that was just what I was
Oh,
focusing.
wow. It had to be done.
Yeah, that was it. That was my main objective. Like, and very, very, I can be very maniacally focused on things when I want to get it done. Uh, so that was it. 4 months, do it, all edits, reviews, chapters, everything.
It's great that you went specifically to people who are not technical, but I think one of the biggest struggles in any kind of use cases and implementing technology is tech team not understanding business and vice versa.
I think that's the hardest part that we have. Like, book aside, I think I was a practitioner. My first job, and I don't know if everyone knows a story or not, but like I thought I was going to play professional sports my entire life. I thought I was going to play rugby my entire life. And then in my 20s, I was like, okay, maybe I should pick a profession and not be in professional sports. I just wasn't recovering as fast. And the first job I took was a data engineer.
Hmm.
I could write code, but I was horrible at it. I didn't enjoy it. And my teammates, even at some point in time, they're like, Sol, you're not allowed to touch a lick of code again. And I was like, okay, so what am I supposed to do? So I was accepted in the tribe, but I wasn't nearly as good as the developers that I had worked with. And interestingly enough, we were always getting requests from the business, but no one from our team was communicating our work back to the business. We had individuals who weren't connected to our team doing that work. And sometimes they got it, sometimes they didn't get it. And so my career actually started being that translator because I wasn't a great developer. I didn't know necessarily all the business jargon. I didn't know how to run a P&L. I didn't know any of that stuff. So, but I was better than the folks in the team and I found sort of my calling. And then I got to know the business and it was around understanding what are their strategic priorities? What are they aiming to achieve? Is it efficiency, margins, and EBITDA? Or is it around growth strategies and markets and channels? And I would just sit in some calls. I took some courses to like, how does one even run a financial sheet? And I just got a hold of the business language. And that was important to me. And so what ended up happening was as I was connecting the dots with the great work that my teammates were doing with the dots of what the business needed. And I just brought it together. So imagine that like Venn diagram, the 2 circles that don't meet. And then I just found that area in between. And that was the role I played for a decade and a half. You didn't know what to call it. It was a business analyst and it was a data analyst because you're not called a translator.
Translator, exactly.
And then I got into MDM, then I became a tech lead, then I was the primary lead on these ERP deployments, and things just kind of Christmas treed its way up. But bridging the gap between the worlds was my advantage. I accidentally stepped into it, but I immersed myself into it and I studied the business like no others. Then I started getting invited to the business meetings. When I started getting invited, that's when the pivot really happened, because then I knew how they were talking. Then I knew what was important to them. I already knew the work we were doing. And then everything was converting that technical work into what was relatable for them. And then that was a game changer.
Yeah, but I guess this is only already half success. Was it difficult for you to convince those decision makers to try to risk? Because there are lots of different factors at play, right? It's not only if it's efficient, if it's going to potentially generate some money.
So when I was in management consulting and I was doing these big delivery projects, the client had already subscribed or chosen, and I was with IBM and Ernst & Young, to work with us. So there wasn't much selling because they knew they needed it and they would bring us in. I was purely in deployment and delivery. So it was a matter of just getting the job done and getting it done well, and then making sure that I let them know where some of the pitfalls were and making different decisions. But it wasn't until I got to the C-suite that I realized how much the business did not appreciate data and analytics and tech. I'm going to use like an umbrella term. I know we use words like tech as an enabler, but part of that also means that it's an afterthought. Here's what I want to do. Go figure it out. But they don't want to be involved in the sausage making, and they have to be involved in the sausage making, because sometimes they may ask for something. It's not really what they want. And then you go off building something and you realize, and they're like, that's not what I wanted. And you're like, well, this is what you said. And you put in all that effort and time and you kill yourself because you want to deliver a great product, only to find out that no, they meant something else. Okay. So or the second is they may be asking for something, but if you have any business sense, you realize it's actually not what they need. What they need is this. And so you have to have that dialogue with them. Or they may say that we want to be a data-driven company, or we want to be data-centric, AI-centric, and use all the buzzwords that they use with the executive leadership team or with the board of directors. But what does that really mean? And is the workforce ready for that? More than likely not, because you have a lot of institutional workers. And so the C-suite was actually where I made a lot of my mistakes, especially my first role, because I realized that I can't convince them because I know the space, and I can't convince them because we're going to build really cool stuff. What I learned first and foremost in my first C-suite gig was you have to build the relationships with them and ask for nothing in return. And then once you build the relationships and you ask for something in return, they're willing to give you a chance because they bought into you. I had no idea that's what this game was about. And I made that mistake. I didn't. I thought just being smart was good enough and building cool things were good enough. And that was not the case. I'm fortunate. I'm an ambivert, meaning I'm an extrovert. I could work a room. I can go into any social setting. I don't get nervous. I enjoy talking to people, but I do need to retreat to re-energize. So building the relationships and making friends isn't difficult for me. So thereafter, I was able to do it. But I learned from the first C-suite gig that I had that without the relationships, it doesn't matter how good you are. It's just not part of their operating model or the business. It's not at their core, and they're not going to get it. And if you do find that one unicorn stakeholder, it's very, very rare.
But going back to your book, are those kind of lessons and advice, is it included in your book as well? For example, are you providing any frameworks for non-technical or maybe less extrovert people to, who want to embrace AI and who want to do something, but they are aware that they are not being heard?
Yes, that for sure. I think the challenge that we have is when you grow up in a very technical world, you're really good at coding and developing and formats and standards and processes and procedures and protocols and things like that. However, that's when you want to scale something, when you need to evangelize something, when you need to grow that capability, those skill sets that you have in actually developing the product go by the wayside. And so, like, even which product to build or which use case to pursue, I've had a lot of AI use cases come my way where they're like, we're going to do this because it has the highest business value. And I was like, that's not the one we should choose at all. And they're like, well, why not? I'm
Mhm.
like, if we choose to do this, we can manage it at a POC level, but we're going to get stuck in perpetual POC purgatory because we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the people, we don't have the talent, and we can't embed it in our existing operating models when we want to push it to production. So it's going to be forever stuck here. So we should actually
Mhm.
focus on these business cases. So like one framework I teach is if you have influencer decision making on which use cases to pursue, never pick it based on business value because every use case has business value. It depends on who's presenting it. There could be manufacturing team, supply chain, procurement, finance, a brand, a label. If they have a problem and they want you to solve it, there's business value in that. So
No.
how are you going to mediate or be the neutralizer and determine which one takes priority and which one doesn't? You don't want to hurt any of the potential relationships or hurt people's feelings by not prioritizing it. But at the same time, they all have merit. And you can't go, well, this one has a potential to grow, but this one has the potential to increase our productivity. You get in this weird subjective,
Mhm.
qualitative argument, and it's a bad place to be. So what I learned along the way was you base a use case based on complexity and criticality. Criticality of the organizations. There's financial consequences and fines. There's PR threats. There's competitive threats. Market share is shrinking, right? There's things to look at, and that's in the toolkit. But then there's also the complexity to deploy. And there's 5 or 6 markers to take a look at. Do you have the following in your infrastructure? Do you have the following in your data? Not all data is created equal. There's different
Mm.
tiers. And don't expect your data to be perfect. It never is. But how do you pick the tiers that are actually going to give you the ability to be as successful as possible with the state of the current hygiene? And then the talent. And then there's a way to plot it against a quadrant and then how to pick which ones to prioritize. So how to select a use case. What even goes into a data strategy? What goes into an AI strategy? Or if you're ready, what process is part of planning and design and solutioning and deploying? I have a funny chapter just focused on what I call the project killer, and that's your team. How do
Okay.
you have the luxury of building a team? What should you look for? Key characteristics. And then how do you map them out on a will and skill matrix? They have the skill set and they're willing to do the work. If you have someone who has a skill set but not willing to do the work, you got to make organizational changes. But if you have someone
Mm.
willing to do the work, doesn't have the skill set, but yet it's coachable, coach them. They're still an asset. That's if you're building it.
Yeah.
But if you're inheriting a team, there are these classic archetypes that keep showing up: the know-it-all, the naysayer, the cheerleader, the evangelist, the
Yes.
doer. And there's about 10 that I've outlined and saying everyone can serve a purpose, especially in large organizations where you may not be able to make changes and you're forced to work with people. Where do you embed them into the process so you can work with them so you can reduce the frustrations? So just stuff like that. And then there's a lot of technical stuff in there too, but in business language. Like I
Mhm.
outline 10 industries and 10 functions and give 3 use case in each industry and 3 use case in each function. So you get 30 and 30. So there's 60 actual AI applications that are in market today. And that's just to inspire and get us to think outside of our box around content creation. There's
Right.
just generative AI stuff out there. So it's all over the stuff. But I'd like to think that non-technical people could actually start.
So it helps to select the team. It helps. It can help people to find the owners of the project as well, and the enablers.
Yeah. And there's just a lot of how-tos. Like if you're going to present to the board or an executive team or investors, how do you prepare? What do you need to do? Like basic stuff. Um, but even if you're a business owner, like one of the examples I had was I worked with a business owner. He was the CEO of a $250 million revenue producing company. They don't have technology in their backbone whatsoever, but they want to do AI. So it's also like not everything's about building foundational models and not everything's about models and algorithms. There's so many off the shelf solutions out there that are either free extensions that can either provide you immediate value, or you can try trial basis and see if it's something you can integrate. I make recommendations. I wasn't sponsored or anything, so I picked 10 different categories, and I made off the shelf recommendations of just get started. And here are some easy to use ones. The whole point is start. You can't
Mm-hmm.
get perfect the first time around. So whether you're a business owner that doesn't have a technical bone in your body and you want people to absorb AI, here's what to do. Or if you're a technical person and you want to evangelize and scale all the AI capabilities you've built, here's how you follow the strategy and the processes and how to present. How do you build a team? So I'd like to think it covers the spectrum, but by no means the theoretical, futuristic, or technical deep dive of what AI is. There is content out there.
Yeah.
Look for
Do
it.
you also help this, I guess, the almost impossible
Yeah.
task, but do you help to spot early, just hyped products which have little in common with
There's
AI or?
on, I have this running joke. I have about 7 different newsletters, both public and private, that get sent to me on a
Mhm.
daily basis of the top AI tools or AI companies that were born that day, and also the top AI companies that unfortunately um, are not alive today because they ran out of funding. And so keeping track of that fluctuation is intense. But there's some stuff in the book as well that addresses that. And how do you avoid the risk of investing in a company without being overly invested? Because you just
Mhm.
don't know the longevity of these companies. There's just so many born right now in the marketplace.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We will see how everything unfolds. So, do you also help to understand what are the common misconceptions executives have about AI capabilities and limitations?
Yeah, one of the things that I've had the advantage of doing since 2011, and I owe a lot to IBM in giving me this opportunity, and an old boss of mine named Jay Bellissimo. Um, I've always had the opportunity to present to either the board or C-level executives of what AI is and what AI is not. And like we all determine it as artificial intelligence, but with a lot of the capabilities that existed in 2011, 12, up
Hmm.
until now, my humble opinion is anyone who's deploying any sort of AI, it's not artificial intelligence. It's not artificial at this point in time. There's automated intelligence, there's augmented intelligence, there's anticipatory intelligence, right? So all the predictive models. There's automation to reduce, remedial, repetitive, easy tasks, and there's augmentation to be able to help knowledge workers or consumers with chatbots and things like that. But I haven't come across a single application that's artificial in nature.
Hmm.
Um, Everything's been focused on augmented, automated, or anticipatory. And so part of it is also explaining how do you even define something that's AI versus it's not? And a lot of
Yeah.
companies are putting the AI brand and logo, and they're going to charge you a premium for it. There's also a section on what it is and what it isn't, and then how not to fall victim to just someone slapping an AI logo and saying it's AI based.
Hmm.
In actuality, it's not. But because I've had the opportunity of presenting to so many different boards and executives, I've got that language down now, and I've got some fun little cartoons and examples and scenarios that I just put those into the conversation, and it's an easy and fun, sometimes a whiteboarding session, sometimes just a discussion.
In your background, you had a chance to work for large organizations, and also you worked with disruptive startups.
Mm-hmm.
And what would you say are the key similarities and differences you have seen in those two, let's say, different worlds and deploying AI?
Similarities, both environments are chaotic. Notice
True.
being in a larger enterprise that things are more streamlined, they're more process driven, and they're not. If anything, they're larger, more complicated matrix, and there's more human challenges to deal with. So chaotic. But when you're in a startup, and I had the pleasure of starting my own company a long time ago, working at a startup, and now advising startups, it's also chaotic. You have no processes. It's lean and mean. You're the plumber, the janitor, the developer, and the CEO, and you're creating a pitch deck to investors so you can get your seed round funding all at the same time. It's also chaotic. Um, so both environments are chaotic. There's no green grass on one side versus the other. with enterprises, you get the security of a paycheck. You get the wonderful support of a brand and a logo, especially if you believe in their missions and values. Um, you get to work with some smart peers, and you get to work with some really not smart peers, and you wonder how they even got the job to begin with. You
Mm-hmm.
really get a great sense of the workforce because not everyone is there to make an impact, have a purpose, and do great things. It is so clearly obvious who shows up to get a paycheck. It's so clearly obvious. And when you're not that person, it fundamentally goes against your DNA. Um, and that's the hard part because showing up is good enough in the enterprise world. And when you're leading a transformation, you're trying to do something different, or you're trying to have an impact in an area that they've been struggling in the past, it's really, really hard to work with those individuals who are just not motivated and just don't have the skill, and you have no choice. So that's where a lot of the frustration is. I think the other aspect of it is because it is that mixed bag of nuts of high performers and steady state performers and low performers, things move very slow. Decision making takes time. So I naturally work at a very different speed than enterprise. So I always have to slow down to meet their speed. Sometimes I'm successful and sometimes I'm not. In the
Mm-hmm.
startup world, however, it's very different in the sense that you have purpose, you have impact. You don't know if you're going to be around in a year or two. And who you bring on board, your circle of five, are the most critical hires, the most critical hires. So you may bond and you may build that tribe, but every person has such heavy weight in how well this company moves forward that there's an inherent risk on that side. So, and the part that I'm least fond of is you're always in a selling mode because you're competing with every other startup and every other scale up out there. And so you really have to rely on your network and your investor community to be able to give you a leg to stand on. So both have its good and bads, if you will. I love both environments. For my future, I never say no to anything, but for me, it's not about the work anymore. Been there, done that. I know it, about who I work with. And so my peers in my leadership team are probably going to be the most influential factor on where I work because I can create anywhere I go. It's a matter of who gives me the runway and clears the runway for me to be able to create and evangelize. So it's who I work with, not what I'm doing.
It's the perfect reason for working in general. And in everything you do, and you said, your ethos emphasizes pragmatism, right? So your philosophy, as I read, states that not everything needs to be bleeding edge. So how can companies balance desire to be cutting edge and with achieving solid business outcomes and foundations?
There is so much low hanging fruit
Mm-hmm.
that like below leading edge and being innovative, or sorry, below being cutting edge and being innovative. Innovation is great. I love discovering new things. I love building new things. But a lot of the work that still needs to be done is foundational, is fundamental. It's streamlining certain things. It's taking that group of 6 people that have all the knowledge in their heads that's never been documented, that
Mm-hmm.
follow a process based on what I call sneakernet and not the internet. They don't use workflows. They just use email to talk to each other. It's inefficient. It's unproductive. It's not streamlined. And you would be amazed at how many companies have made it to 1 billion, 2 billion, 15 billion, and 40 billion based off of sneakernet, not internet. Some of it's because they have a product that you can't live without. Some of it's because they have a product that's gotten great traction because there's heavy virality on social media. Regardless of the reason, there's so much improvement to be made to streamline processes that I'm like, if you don't have the rigor, you don't have the maturity, technology is not at the core, but sometimes an afterthought, or you consider it an enabler, but not a major facilitator in making your business happen. Being bleeding edge sounds great. Thinking of the art of the possible is fantastic, but your deployment needs to be based on the art of the practical. You have to take into consideration the workforce that you have at hand. And here's my example. Moving forward, like in my interviews, My first question is, what's the average tenureship of an employee? And do you offer a pension fund? Why would I ask those two questions? Because if they have a pension fund, I automatically know people don't leave. They're sticking around.
Mm-hmm.
They want to get their pension.
Mm-hmm.
Those that have been there 15, 20, 25, 30 years, how up to date and innovative can they honestly, like being realistic, can they really be? They know one environment and one environment only. There are no benchmarks. There's no compare and contrast. And the organization values that, which naturally means that the way that company can excel, improve margins, EBITDA, be put up for sale, be acquired, or continue to grow. Top line revenue is great, but there's so much margin to be made in the processes because you've got a workforce that hasn't necessarily been exposed to what streamlined processes look like, only the processes they know of. So I can tell an organization's maturity and how much quote unquote bleeding edge capabilities they're able to do and absorb just based on asking the question, do you have a pension fund plan and the average tenureship of an employee? I now know that that organization is going to be mostly process optimization and that low hanging fruit, assuming there's a mandate top down. Otherwise, you're threatening the knowledge workers that have been doing the same thing the same way for a really long time. So innovation doesn't necessarily come from being bleeding edge. I think sometimes just cutting through the noise and being a lot more efficient at doing things so you can do more of it.
True. Have you ever had the chance to work with Japanese organizations? They operate in a similar way in terms of preserving what they do best, and there are some of the longest longest standing companies.
So interestingly, Sony Music, owned by Sony, is a Japanese-based company. But of course, it's a music industry, so you get your own spin-off of it, and it definitely operates as a very separate entity. It was weird because I worked at the music label. There were elements of the Japanese culture that spilled through that we had to respect. And then there were elements where we could just be a rowdy bunch and be a music label. I worked for someone who believed that you had to be in the office Monday through Friday, 9 to 6. And I was living in Miami, commuting to New York when I first took the job. And I said, is that mandatory? Because the best coders, the best developers, the best data scientists that I know don't work 9 to 6. They kind of have their own rhythm. They have their own cadence. Now, of course, they would be a part of team meetings and outings and celebrations and status updates, but they do their best work at night and they sleep in the morning. So I don't necessarily want the people that are 9 to 6. I want them to be able to have their own schedule, produce the quality work. They're like, no. And I remember my boss was like, no, absolutely. And you have to be in the office too. You have to set the example and you have to be here before they come and you have to stay here after they come. That's the Japanese way. The other aspect that was filling in was when I worked for that company, I could not do any conferences. I could not do any public speaking. I could not do any articles, newsletters, blogs, nothing. So when I talk about I was busy doing the work, not writing the book, a lot of it started from here because they had a rule that says we are a very modest culture. We don't brag about our subject matter expertise and our knowledge. And so we were not allowed to broadcast anything. Our personal brand, our personal thought leadership. The ironic thing is they discovered me and found me because someone recommended me because they heard me speak at a conference. So they heard me speak, but then they weren't allowing me to speak. So it's a very modest, be humble, hush hush culture. And we have a legacy. There's a way to be seen and we have to respect that. So some of that stuff, the methodologies, the very strict way of being and showing up, those things definitely spilled over. But the labels themselves, they could do whatever they wanted. It was the rest of us who followed those rules. So yeah, they are very process oriented. They're very diligent. They're very proper. But I feel it also sometimes lacks transparency and trust and directness because they are more about not being rude, which I understand. You could not be rude and still have an open dialogue about what you disagree with. And they're not willing to do that. So sometimes it's very difficult. And I always say I'm not a mind reader. So I find it very difficult to navigate Japanese-based companies.
Yeah, me too. but there are still, so they their approach to making decision is completely different from European or American. But they had some success in creating innovative products, and so it is possible, like doing it their way.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess the interesting thing is that there are lots of organizations or like larger but family-run businesses where they don't have, because they don't want to share the knowledge, they don't like, for example, the sons or the family members don't want to take over. They are struggling. They have to sell for peanuts, or the businesses are destined to die.
Yeah, no, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I agree with you. It's very challenging and very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've outlined how AI or like data teams can struggle with credibility and bureaucracy and leadership buy-in. So what are your top strategies for overcoming these hurdles?
I have a repeatable approach that I take when I first join. It took me some time and it took me a few positions to figure it out, but I think I finally have it. Because data and analytics, and even in many cases, the AI teams that I've built, we are a service center. We are a function. We don't run the P&L. We're not driving the P&L. So naturally, being a service-based function, you have to approach things a very different way. The first 3 to 4 months, I hold back from any sort of opinions. And it's very hard for me. I have a strong point of view. I will see the obvious things and I will refrain and I will refrain. Because you can never go in as a new leader and call someone else's baby ugly, even though they hired you because they know it's ugly and they want you to transform it. But you can't say it out loud. That's first. Second, in those 3 to 4 months, I meet with everyone possible and I ask a few basic questions. What do you think my role is, my job is? What am I here to do? What are the start, stop, and continues? What should we start doing that we haven't? What should we stop doing that for some reason we keep doing? And what should we continue doing that we really enjoy? And then what are your top 3 priorities? And do you feel my group can impact or help you? Like, that's it. And I just let them talk. That's from CEO to CFO to any C-suite. That's all I ask for. Brand presidents, regional presidents, label presidents. And I just get to know the lay of the land of how people think, what they have to say. Then I meet with their LTs. So I go one layer down, and then I meet with their LTs one layer down. So the first 3 to 4 months, I easily meet anywhere from 200 to 400 people. All I'm doing is hi, listening, taking notes. And then comes that moment in time after the 3-4 months where I'm synthesizing everything. And it's like that scene from A Beautiful Mind where I take everything that's been written down and I start creating themes. What ends up happening is when I present my strategy, here's what I heard. Here are symptoms, but these symptoms are because of these core issues. So here's what we need to fix. Here's what we need to build. And here's what we need to serve. And then I have this thing called the wall of quotes, where I take quotes from all the leaders and everyone, and I group them into bundles. And the reason why this is important is because I didn't make this stuff up. These are literally the day-to-day complaints. And I always reference that. Now, the strategy is set based on what was shared. We agree on what needs to be done. I then go ask for funding. The funding part is a tricky part because part of what I come in for is to fix some of the things that are creating the issues. And so sometimes I have to give them an analogy, and one that I use often. I said, we've got a leaky faucet, in this case, a business process that's creating bad data. I can fix this leaky faucet, but we have 2 ways of doing this. Either you can give me the time and the money so I can go troubleshoot and figure out where the leak is happening, and you've empowered me to fix that leak so that we no longer have a leaky faucet. Or you're going to have to give me enough money to just buy a bunch of pails, and I'm going to put a temporary fix, collect the water, and then bring the next pail, collect the water. I'm never fixing the issue, but I just need a bunch of pails to be able to collect the leaky faucet. So either give me the time and the budget to go fix, and more importantly, the empowerment to actually fix the root cause, or enough money to just buy enough pails so that I can continue to catch the leaky faucet. Like, the choice is yours. I can do either or. Of course, I prefer the root cause. You have to get creative like that, even in the financial discussions, because then you're signing up for it. What ends up happening is you get the support you need, you start. And inevitably, year and a half, people start resisting, they hit fatigue, they start pushing back. I will always revert back to the wall of quotes, the leaky faucet analogy, and the choices that we made and the reasons why we made them, knowing what the consequences were. I have those 3 to 5 slides in a deck, always handy and ready, saying, I understand that what we're experiencing now is a consequence of decisions we all collectively made a year ago, and we highlighted what the consequences were. So we either have to be okay with it, or we can revisit another approach I had suggested and preferred, but at the time it wasn't right for us, which is totally fine. And we won't have to deal with these anymore. And then you have to pull in the right people to make the judgment call. So you have to be very political. You have to be very diplomatic. You have to be very document oriented, because people have amnesia. So you have to remind them of the decisions they made, because you can only do so much. What's that one saying? You can fill the trough with water and lead the horse to the water, but you can't force the horse to drink the water. Like, you just get to that point. So you have to storytell, you have to document, and you have to remind people of the decisions they made and why. Because everyone's always looking to point fingers, and you want to avoid that at all costs.
Yeah. And when something goes wrong, they end up blaming someone who was before you or something. It's
always easy to do that, and that's not
Yeah. It's, I guess I find that the worst bit is navigating the politics and finding people who actually care, versus those who just talk.
Yep.
Do you want to do something do you have some thing to respond to, or? Okay, let's talk about, I know that you've also focused a lot of your sharing lessons is about security, data privacy, fixing the leak, and connecting the data in a way that you can gain insights from it. I saw the other day you posted really cool post on LinkedIn about data hoarding and lack of integration.
Yeah,
I really
collecting the data. We're horrible at connecting the data. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So how can you? I guess you answered that partly before, saying you have to paint the story, but how can you help people understand how much they are missing, how much they are not seeing, because they are not working towards connecting. They are not helping themselves to see solutions.
From a true core data and analytics competency, this is where the data architecture is so important. And this is where the conform layer and the semantic layer and the layers in between really, really matter. The semantic layer is almost the first application layer, an opportunity that gives users who are not familiar with the raw data and the metadata an opportunity to actually work with the data. And so you have non-technical folks who just want to drag and drop and create filters and create dashboards. But in order to do that, you need to connect the information that's coming from multiple sources. Like, even here's an example, right? Not all the data is coming from CRMs and CDPs and ERPs and every other database that we know. We know, right? A lot of it's coming from social information or commerce information, click rates, impressions, etc. But you can collect click rates and impressions. You can collect an IP address for a consumer, and it could be from a consumer that has bought from us before. But you're throwing it that information at them. You're like, oh, we have all this data, but none of it's usable until you find a way to integrate this consumer ID with this IP address has repeatedly visited our website. Great at opening, horrible at closing. And so there isn't a conversion to sales. Well, why isn't there a conversion to sales? And then being able to connect that to which pages are dropped, which products are we recommending that are not catching. That end-to-end storyline, we just often miss. What we do is we give them a bunch of website data, we give them a bunch of client data with transactions, and they're left to interpreting. And unfortunately, they don't have the skill sets to interpret. And because our databases, or data warehouses, or data lakes, or data marts, whatever you want to call it, we don't do a good job of labeling the columns, labeling the data. We have a bunch of like symbols and null values. You can't let them guess how the information should be connected, because then your KPIs, your metrics, anything you present in the dashboard is going to go haywire. So I do fundamentally believe that while we are collecting the data at a rapid pace, really the effort should be on connecting the data so that information is usable. The semantic layer is probably the most exhausting thing I've ever had to build in every organization, because getting everyone to align on a single definition is very difficult. But without it, it's really hard to make that data usable. So I just think it's key, because when people say we need more data, it's never that they actually need more volumes of data. They need more usable data outside of the existing dimensions that you've given them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And do you think with the promise of AI and all LLMs understanding the context of the information and data, not information, do you think it has a chance to help people, maybe not automate, but like speed things up in finding those golden nuggets in the whole lakes of data?
I think there's a lot of great AI capabilities that can give us inference. Like, here's an example. I built my first data lake environment in 2015. Then I got into zoning around 2016, 17. Zones for data scientists, zones for data analysts, and zones for those that were building digital products, et cetera. So I've built those environments across multiple years. And what I've noticed in all of them is, things that should be so easily identifiable, like something as easy as gender. Well, for some reason, when you pull in the column header from the database that tracks gender, it's like 12_XY0 capital CA versus gender. We don't even have the titles for our columns right in our schematics. So how is someone supposed to know what table they're supposed to go into to pull gender? And then what's worse is you'll actually take a look at the data in there, and sometimes it's F, sometimes it's M, sometimes female is spelled out, sometimes gender is spelled out. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you get acronyms because we haven't enforced a specific format. So some capabilities that I've built for my team, because I used to stand up data science teams, and I call data science as a service. We would do some of the more complicated querying and analysis and very bespoke stuff for very specific questions that the business leaders had. And instead of having to understand the schematics behind every single database, we would actually leverage AI in a few cases where it would help us infer what that table, what that schematic, what that column was. So instead of understanding what this 12_03 capital CA is, we would use it for inference and saying that based on the fact that I've read female, FFL, this is a gender column, and we have them do the translations. And then we would actually query off of that translation that our AI model inferred. I think that is super useful, because now we don't have to learn every single schematic or database name and understand what's where. And we always talk about the swamp, right, for the data lake, and things have gotten really messy. Well, yeah, when you don't have catalog and lineage in place, it's going to happen. And many organizations don't, because data cataloging and lineage to me is amazing, but to others, not so sexy. So the funding always gets cut. So you could use some of these AI models to do inference detection, so you actually understand where the information resides in this massive sea of data.
Yeah, definitely very useful application. And human language is so flexible, and especially when companies are growing by acquiring other companies, it's impossible to keep everything in line and synced.
Agreed. Totally.
I'm very curious about this term you are using, stained glass transformations. And you refer to it a lot, and I read that it allows training AI models without exposing sensitive data. So can you explain what kind of and I also read that you patented it.
So I didn't personally patent it. So there's a company that I am partnering with and working with, because what's happened right now in the AI space is, like, whether you're talking to a CIO or a CISO, they're having challenges with training their own foundational models, large language models, machine learning models, because if you're using an off-the-shelf model, or if you're using open source or closed source and API to be able to teach those foundational models, data leakage is just a concern. But if you think about the number of instances where data leakage has happened, it's very, very small. But everyone's concerned about the what if scenarios. Well, what if it leaks? What if the data gets out there? And I'm like, well, what if I cross the street and I get hit by a car that runs a red light? It's possible, but unlikely. So, because I believe in this space and I've seen what it could do, one of the things that I'm starting to evangelize this year is, don't let the what if situations stop you from actually doing good work. And so I'm tackling a very unsexy topic, which is data modeling, data privacy, and how to fix data leakage. And so while there are a lot of security measures out there to deal with information not coming out, the stained glass technology provided by a company called Protopia, I think, is the most promising one at this point in time. And it solves for that very issue, so that people aren't focused on the problem, but they are now focused on the solution.
You are known as a bit of a rogue executive who drives change by strategically challenging the status quo. What does it mean to you?
I've never really fit in completely in the corporate culture. I am not, what's a good way of putting it? Because I've always been brought in to change, to transform, to disrupt the status quo. My job isn't 100% to mesh and continue to do things the way they've always been done. So they used my skill sets and my IQ, to get the work done. I think part of my extroverted personality and SQ, my social quotient, to build the relationships and scale it. But along the way, and inevitably, because I don't do things the way they've always been done, I naturally ruffle some feathers. And I clearly know where there are pockets of issues and challenges and talent that just aren't cutting it for the capabilities that we're trying to build for the future. And I don't call them out per se, but I'm okay challenging, and I'm okay pushing. And I'm okay saying that if we want different results, we need to do things differently. And if you're expecting change with the same exact talent base and the same exact way we're doing it, that's just not going to happen. And I'm not the right person to do it. So I do push people. I do get them past their comfort zone. And going back to our earlier conversation, if you're working with someone who's very comfortable showing up at 9:30 and leaving every day at 4:30, they're not the ones that are going to go out of their way and be totally interested in evangelizing and making an impact and creating change. But I push them. I don't care how they're operating. I only care how I'm operating and my team is operating. And we're setting a very different bar for the organization. So I've gone rogue in a few areas where I push people harder than they want to be pushed, or I'm introducing new things that haven't been introduced before. I think differently. I speak differently. I have a different standard. And so sometimes I could be considered being rogue because I don't fit the standard mold. And I'm very comfortable with being very graceful, but calling out the obvious as well. So I've indirectly been tagged that.
Yeah, but it looks like it serves you well. You are definitely different than most of the execs and leaders
Yeah.
in the tech, especially industry. So how can you challenge for someone who, yeah, I guess who is maybe less extrovert than you? How can you challenge the status quo and lead by principle over fear?
That's a hard question because I think naturally, well, I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to challenge the status quo. I think if you're in a position where they're hiring you because they need something done because it hasn't been done before, you're put in that position. You're meant to challenge. I think the way you do it, though, you have to take into cultural considerations. You have to take into the natural pace of the company. You can't have them drive 120 miles an hour if the fastest they've ever gone is 40. You have to know the talent at hand. Do they have a pension fund in place? Like, those are all different components that you have to take into consideration to understand you are brought on board to change, but calibrating your expectation of how fast you're going to be able to change.
Yeah, but sometimes people are brought on those positions maybe and as a they become the victim of a political game.
Very much so. And there are individuals who are phenomenal at that game. Phenomenal. And that's how they've made their career. They're what I call like professional politicians. They didn't make it because they know an area overly well. They didn't make it because they're very well respected in their area. They made it because they never got into trouble and they tiptoed around what they needed to, and they got far enough. I can spot those people a mile away because you get into a room with them and they're pontificating on something, and you're like, you just read an article and you're regurgitating it to me. And I know that's what you're doing because I know this is an area that you know well whatsoever. But there are individuals that fundamentally built their careers that way, and you have no choice but to work with them. That's just the sad reality.
True. And it reminds me of the Lawrence Peter principle.
Yeah.
You've heard of? Yeah.
But it's good.
I guess
for everyone, because I don't think everyone's heard the Lawrence Peter principle.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was just in the book. Peter argues that promoting incompetent people is the norm, not the exception. And it's he says, in time, every post tends to be occupied by an employee who is incompetent to carry out their duties. He writes, work is accomplished by those employees who who have not reached their level of incompetence. Yes, then the higher those people are, the more they are forgiven in a way.
They are, yeah. And that's the funniest thing. I think and the reason why that resonated, the first thing I learned is being an executive is less about your IQ and more about your EQ, SQ, and BQ. You don't actually, there are some brilliant executives, please don't get me wrong, and I have to put that out there. Brilliant executives who fundamentally understand and have their finger on the pulse with how to move things, maneuver things. And I learn from them every single day. But in a small case, and I don't know if it's majority, but I would say in my experience, and this is personal, it's been 50-50. You question, you're like, why are you in the position you're in? It just doesn't make any sense. Realize that the higher up you go, it is less about how smart you are. It's more about how well you get along with others.
Yeah. And what can you do for them? Or what can they do for you?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Something close to it. So you filter for those who simply get shit done.
Yeah.
What are the signs you look for in vetting those transformation soldiers?
I'm a GSDer. I like getting shit done. I'm very biased towards action. But not everyone again is built that way. But I don't do this unless I'm 100% in it, love it, or want to pursue it maniacally. And so I've always taken that approach to my position. But again, not everyone is built that way. So there is a group of other GSDers that I have known and gotten to know, and I adore them because we just want to get good stuff done. So I think I always say it's a mentality and a mindset. I really, really appreciate it. This was fun. This was great. Thank you.
Likewise, and all the best with your book. It's been doing great so far, but
Yeah.
I'm really looking for hard copy
Yeah.
end of April. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
and all
You
the
got it.
best. Thanks, so. Bye bye.